Hello, Riga. How are you all doing? Doing okay? Good. Before I start, I have to say that I'm not a monitoring person. I'm a database person. I don't know if you read my resume. I actually have more than 40 years of relational databases. When I joined the database business, the first company I worked for was Oracle. And someone might shiver about that, but I was a day when Oracle had something like 500 employees worldwide. So that was a long, long time ago. That was Oracle version 4, which was actually the first, at least somewhat usable version. If you think Oracle version 4 was the 4th version, you're wrong, because there never was a version 1. The first version was 2. The next version 3 was basically a rewrite in C, and then they decided to make it usable, and that was version 4. So, what am I here to talk about? I'm here to talk about MariaDB, which is the company I work for right now, some of the products we have, and I'm going to talk about how to monitor and work with that with Zabbix. Now, before I start, remember, I'm a database guy. I'm not a Zabbix expert, right? So don't expect any Zabbix wizardry being from me here, right? I'm just going to talk about these things as far as I know them, and I've tried to apply Zabbix to MariaDB and MaxScale in particular, and hope that's going to be useful for you guys. So, I got an agenda. What am I going to talk about? I'm going to introduce myself so you know who I am. I already started doing that. Then I'm going to talk about MariaDB Galera cluster. Some of you might be using it, but there are a couple of things to that is interesting. And if you are using it, there's some things I can say about it. If you're not using it, there might be some use for you there. Then I'm going to talk about MariaDB MaxScale. MariaDB MaxScale is a database proxy for use with MariaDB, so that needs to be explained. I'm going to say a few words about using MariaDB and MariaDB MaxScale as a repository for your own Zabbix setup. And I'm going to do that and following up with a demo later on. Now, this demo is kind of scary. I hope it works fine, because I've set up a Galera cluster. I also have a separate cluster for Zabbix itself, and I got Zabbix running, and I got 2 MaxScales, one for Zabbix and one to monitor. So that's something like 7 virtual machines running on my laptop right now. So I hope all this holds together. I do have some issues with that setup, but the demo is going to work fine anyway. And we're going to talk about how to configure that. I'm going to do a demo. There are some conclusions, and hopefully there are some questions and some answers. So, an introduction. Who am I? Well, I'm a principal sales engineer here at MariaDB. I've been a sales engineer most part of my career, which I said is like more than 40 years. And some of you might not like the term sales in my title, but I'm pretty salesy, but I'm also kind of technical. I do both. How many of you are running MariaDB? There you are. You can run the command show authors, and at the top of that list, I'm actually there somewhere. I'm proud of that. I've been working with the relational databases for a long, long time for a whole bunch of different companies. Oracle, MySQL, times 10, MariaDB, and a bunch more that I don't want to mention, with different jobs, but mostly as a sales engineer. But I've been a consultant, I've been in support, I've been a database architect for a while and doing all sorts of stuff. When I'm not engaged with databases, I try to spend time with my kids. These are my 2 twins. They're a bit older now. They're 11. They turned 12 in a month. And some special interest that I spend time with is, well, I got a great interest in old computers, old software, old hardware, all of that kind of stuff. Ancient technology in general. If you want to talk to me, feel free to do that, but do that after I stop talking. If you start me talking about old computers, I basically will not stop, and you will not learn anything about MariaDB Galera cluster or MaxScale or any of that, which is why I came here. So don't tempt me now. As for MariaDB, who are we as a company? Well, you probably know us as like the open source community MariaDB database that's been around for a while, basically since well, Monty didn't want to be hired by Oracle and left to start his own company, and that sort of turned into MariaDB eventually. I was there all the time, actually. I was at MaxScale. I joined MaxScale more than 20 years ago. I was there for quite a while, and then I did something else for a couple of years, and then I went back and worked for MariaDB. So I've been with MariaDB for 12 years by now. And been through all of these products. So what is MariaDB Enterprise Server? Well, it builds on MariaDB Community Server, but with some enterprise features, such as like enhanced auditing, slightly better backup, some high availability features, and stuff like that. There's long-term support included. Then we got MariaDB MaxScale. MaxScale is our own product. Is MaxScale open source? You might ask yourself that, because I'm amongst open source friends here, right? And I would say maybe not. Depends on how you look at it. MariaDB MaxScale is licensed under a business source license, which is like a halfway house between a commercial license and an open source license. It's kind of restrictive, but it's also time-bombed, which means that after 4 years with BSL, BSL turns into GPL. So there are GPL versions of MaxScale out there, but they're like 4-ish years old, right? If you want the newest one, you need the license, and you get that from us. But in any case, even if it's BSL or GPL, the source code is there and it's open, right? So anyone can read and work with the code. We also develop MariaDB connectors. I wanted to mention that because they are somewhat different than what you get from Oracle/MyScale, in particular in terms of licensing. All our connectors are LGPL licensed. I don't know if everybody understands the significance of that, but it is semi-significant. And we also develop a bunch of tools for managing MariaDB databases. But I want to skip past that and get into the meat of what we're going to talk about. Is there anyone in the room running Galera cluster? I think so. Yeah, there are a few hands there. Good, good. Running Galera cluster. Galera is a synchronously replicated cluster solution, right? It's somewhat different from when you're using MariaDB in a straightforward, classic, replicated manner. But it's not only difference in terms of the replication being synchronous. MariaDB Galera is much more than just like synchronously replicated MariaDB, right? It adds features like split brain detection, conflict detection and resolution, automatic node provisioning, and stuff like that. It's a pretty cool solution. It's very efficient. It's very fast. The focus on this thing is high availability, right? If you think this is going to give you more servers, which means we can have multi-master and read scalability, actually, you're not going to get that. You get it somewhat, but not a lot of it. The main focus it is high availability and scalability for reads, right? That's the big thing with MariaDB Galera cluster. So in summary, because I don't want to spend too much time on all this supporting these technologies, I want to get into like Zabbix eventually. So in summary, what are the good things with MariaDB Galera cluster? Well, it uses the inbound InnoDB engine. Any kind of optimizations and how things work and the data types you can use and all of that stuff, that is the same whether you're running Galera or not. Read scalability is there, and you can query any data on any node. It's synchronously replicated, so you can run any query on any node. The data is synchronously updated across the nodes. So that is fine. But the data is on all nodes and replicated to all nodes. That's also negative, right? It means that the more nodes I have, the more stuff I need to write. There's just like no escaping it. And this is what limits write scalability, right? There's no way out of it. And I must replicate all data to all nodes. And I need to do that in a synchronous way to all the nodes, right? And like a write operation on one node is not committed until it's been replicated to all the other nodes in the cluster. So the read scalability is there somewhat. Typically what you say is that the write scalability, if you're lucky, and you balance your write really well across the cluster, you can achieve something like 1.5 to 2 times the write performance of a single node in a cluster like that. But that's about it. After that, it won't scale much more, right? And we know that. Galera themselves admit that this is the case. And there's an issue with Galera, that is that if you have very large databases, now we're talking about multi-terabyte databases. Let's say, I mean, I've got customers with like 10 terabyte Galera databases that work. On the other hand, those are customers with 1 terabyte of RAM. They are customers with like the fastest networking money can buy, the fastest hard disks that money can buy, and machines that cost like millions of dollars each, right? But then you can have really large databases. For like normal size hardware that all of us use, I would see that somewhere along the lines of half to 1 terabyte is when you want to get careful with your Galera and what you do with it. I can talk separately about why this is so. So, MariaDB MaxScale, that's a bit more exciting. So MariaDB MaxScale is a transparent database proxy. It's tucked in between the servers that you see down there and the users. It is transparent in the sense that it uses the same protocol, the same SQL syntax, the same everything on both sides of the equation, right? So you don't need to change the like MariaDB connector. You don't need to change anything on the server side. There's nothing to add and nothing to change. You can just tuck in MariaDB MaxScale in between. You listen to MaxScale, and MaxScale will distribute the load for you. So it's completely transparent. The main use for MariaDB MaxScale is to achieve high availability and to achieve a level of read scalability, right? That's what MaxScale is there for, right? But it does do a bunch of other cool things, like streaming. Like you want to get Kafka stream out of your MariaDB stuff. Well, MaxScale is what you want. You want to get a Kafka streamed into. Well, it can deal with that one too. And a bunch of things like that it does, right? Data masking, streaming, logging, all sorts of stuff. There's something like around 50 different plugins that MaxScale comes with that does all sorts of weird and wonderful things to your IT environment. MariaDB MaxScale is written in C and C++. Regrettably, most of it these days is converted to C++. Not that I mind C++, but I happen to be born with C. I got more than, it's actually around 50 plus years with C now. So I'm pretty sad to see it go away, but there you go, that's life. I learned to code in C on the PDP 1170, running Unix version 6 in the early 1980s. Old-time stuff. Right. For high availability, MariaDB MaxScale is there and, to implement high availability. But MariaDB MaxScale is also highly available in and of itself. You can have multiple MaxScale. It's basically a stateless box in between like your application and your server. It's stateless. It can synchronize its configuration between multiple instances. It comes with a GUI and an API and the CLI that can all do the same thing. It can modify the configuration, and you can modify the configuration without having to restart MaxScale. You can add, remove servers, take servers out of operation, change the configuration. All sorts of stuff can be done live. You can take nodes out of operation into drain mode or whatever, all sorts of stuff. For read scaling, and this illustration is using a traditional replicated setup with one primer and a couple of replicas. The situation is similar if you're running with Galera. Typically with Galera, you do a read-write split, and we only write to one of the nodes in the cluster. There are some reasons why we do that even with Galera, even though Galera is multi-master. And I can talk about that separately afterwards if someone wants to just approach me and we can talk about that. All of these protocols and filters and stuff like that you see here are actually plugins to MariaDB MaxScale. MaxScale is very reliant on plugins. It basically will not work without plugins. And there are loads of different plugins to use, and everything is a plugin. It's very configurable. And one thing with the plugins in MaxScale is that MaxScale actually knows about these plugins. So it's not like you need to sort of like download them separately or know where they're at. You basically just configure them in MaxScale, and MaxScale knows where to find them and will sort of like run them, right? But there are a whole bunch of them doing different things like. So request comes in, there's a protocol, typically that's a MariaDB protocol, right? MariaDB client protocol, that's what most people use, but there's actually a NoSQL protocol. There are some other protocols being developed as we speak. We go through a couple of filters. There's a router that determines where traffic should go. Is it the read? Go to one of the replicas. Is it the write? Goes to the primary server. It does this routing based on information about the server that's collected by the monitor that puts the service state in a global in-memory thing for the router to read. So that's how we do read scaling. Looking at failover, and this is failover with a classic replicated setup. MaxScale knows how to deal with that. So MaxScale can basically, if the primary node fails, MaxScale can take that one out of operation, promote the replica to a master, redirect replication from the other nodes, and keep going. If you have a Galera cluster, MaxScale can do this too, but obviously there's no promotion going on because with Galera, all the nodes are write possible. You just redirect writes to another node and you're all set. But the process is different, but the effect for the user is basically similar. It can sort of like move things around like this. This one needs to be configured. This one doesn't work out of the box, but there's some configuration to do because this requires some extra work, as everyone can understand. Okay? Right. So getting closer to MaxScale, or getting closer to Zabbix and further away from MariaDB. I'm just going to say a few words about MaxScale with Zabbix. If you want to use MariaDB as your repository for Zabbix and you want that to be a highly available repository, well, you can actually, as I'm doing here. We work with two nodes. We use replication. If one of them then should fail, MaxScale will fail over to the other. Even if both nodes are up and running, one is the primary, one is the replica, reads will go to the replica, so I get some extra read performance for Zabbix here. This works out of the box. This is what actually exactly what I got to demo here. So as you can see, there are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's actually 8 virtual machines running on my laptop right now to support all this. If you're running Oracle, try running 5 instances of Oracle on your laptop. It will struggle with 1. Nothing wrong with Oracle, but I'm just telling you how it is. Okay, so MaxScale with replication with MariaDB will work fine as a repository for Zabbix, right? We use the usual kind of monitoring here, right? So all the MaxScale nodes, or all the MariaDB server nodes are monitored by the agent. I'm using agent 2 in my example. I'm using HTTP to monitor the MaxScale servers. I'm going to tell you why in just a few seconds. So now we're getting to what we really want to talk about. And before we get there, oh God, can I just talk about Zabbix? Can't you get there to the point? It was Zabbix you want to talk about. Why do you talk about all this MariaDB stuff? I'm getting there. Bear with me, right? So if you have a cluster environment, there's some things you need to watch out for. And when I look at monitoring, what monitoring people look at, they tend to focus on servers, right? Which is fine for most things. But when you got a cluster of servers, you also need to look at the cluster as a whole. If I got a 3-node Galera cluster and one of those servers fails, from a server point of view, that's a disaster. The server is down. From a cluster point of view, oh, it's something that you want to fix, but you might not need to do it right now because the cluster still works, right? So you want to look at the whole thing. The state of the cluster isn't necessarily the same thing as the sum or the least of the state of all the involved servers, right? And there's stuff that you want to monitor and work with that deals with the interaction between servers. For those of you running MariaDB Galera cluster, are you making sure that you don't have too many flow control events? Are you looking at, if you're running replication, are you like keeping track of like replication lag and stuff like that? There are things you want to look at that has to do with the cluster itself and not to do with how the cluster is exposed to the other environment, right? Stuff to view, stuff to work with, like not necessarily relevant for single server or like for anyone outside the cluster itself, but relevant for the cluster itself. And of course, if you're using a cluster or a load balancer to manage things, you want to make sure that the load balancers are working too, right? If you have two of them, one for failover and the one you want to failover fails, you want to know that so you can fix it so when the first one fails, you don't stand there and don't have any at all, right? So you want to monitor and keep track of those things also. So monitoring MaxScale with Zabbix. We're lucky, right? We can use REST JSON, and there's a very good REST JSON API for MariaDB MaxScale. It's good because it follows established standards, right? So basically, you can use HTTP monitoring, an HTTP agent, as it's called in Zabbix, out of the box, right? With basic authentication, and you will get the data from MaxScale. And MaxScale monitors a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff coming out of MaxScale that you can monitor. I'm not going to look at all of this stuff, right? Now, there is no MaxScale monitoring template included out of the box with Zabbix, but that's fine. There are a bunch of them out there. Most of them, though, use one of the command line interfaces to use with an agent. I prefer to use the REST API. I think that is more cool. And this is one of the few MaxScale templates out there that does just that. So this is the one that I typically use. What we're going to do here, though, is look at how you can set up your own monitoring of this thing. We're going to look at a couple of examples and stuff like that, some custom monitoring. But the cool thing with that, and the cool thing with MaxScale is that MaxScale can monitor so much stuff, and it can manage multiple clusters, for example. You have filters and all sorts of stuff, and all the data on that is actually available through the REST API. So you can discover your cluster by just going to MaxScale. You don't need to go to individual servers. Discovering, let's say, a cluster of replicated MariaDB servers, well, you need to go to individual servers and figure out who is replicating where. With MaxScale, you don't need to do that. You just go to MaxScale, and MaxScale resolves all those conflicts for you. So, now we're getting technical, somewhat technical, right? To be able to use Zabbix to monitor MariaDB MaxScale out of the box, right, using the REST API, HTTP API, REST JSON, we need to set up a couple of things. Most of this is pretty cool. This is like standard MaxScale configuration. The parameter to watch for is the last one, admin secure GUI. That one is by default true, and that is the security thing. And if that is set to true, which is the default, you require all those SSL certificates and all of that stuff, which security experts want. Like, I don't hope there are any security experts in this room, which means I can safely go ahead and set that one to false and ignore setting up SSL certificates and all of that stuff, which is simple. It only takes a week or so to do. So that's a basic thing. We all know how it goes with SSL certificates, right? So that's basic what you need to do. And then, I'm sorry, but now at this point, when you configure these things, you need to restart MaxScale, right? Sorry. Well, once that is up and going, things are actually kind of simple, right? This is basically the macros that are used by the template we looked at before, but it's also the same macros that I use to connect to MariaDB MaxScale to get the data through the REST JSON API. We need a port, we need a host name, we need a username, and we need a password, right? Because we're unsecure guys, we're ignoring SSL certificates and all of that crap, so fair enough. So this is basically all we need, and I'm going to use this later on in my... Then we want to set up some items, right? And this is kind of basic stuff, right? This particular item that I'm setting up here is going to be the base item for some stuff. So if you look at the URL up there, it's kind of nothing surprising about that, except that, oh, I've hard-coded the port, right? That was bad on me. But it's the /servers, right? This will give me all the data on all the servers that MaxScale knows about, right? And to get this from MaxScale, well, this is the URL I need. It's the only thing missing that you don't see on this slide, because it's at the bottom of this page, is that there's basic HTTP authentication, and we insert the macros for username and password. That's about it. We got the data. This will just get us a huge JSON blob, though, not much useful for monitoring, but it's a good point for monitoring other things. You can get all sorts of stuff on your servers from that, right? Now, I've also created a separate template. I'm just going to show you that because this is something I'm doing, right? But this is basically an idea of like monitoring Galera. Now, for doing Galera is monitored by MaxScale. And what I wanted to do when I started off doing this was like have auto-discovery of the clusters, and then I wanted to have auto-discovery of the nodes within the cluster, which meant I needed to have two-level auto-discovery. And I couldn't figure out how to get that work, so instead I'm just like putting in the name of the cluster in the other. It's probably me not being good enough with Zabbix. So what are we doing here? Well, here's an item prototypes that we're doing, right? This guy is basically just using the cluster. I'm getting some data from the cluster. And note here, the cluster is collecting information and collecting statistics beyond what it needs to do its routing. So here we're getting the number of reads and the number of writes, right? Which is somewhat the sum of all the reads and writes across all the servers, but not necessarily so, right? And this is what MaxScale sees, and the number of reads it puts forward to the replicas that are then distributed across the replicas. That's what we're doing, right? So we're getting data from MaxScale for cluster-wide operations, right? This is nothing exciting. I'm going to skip past it. You've done this yourself a gazillion times because you're experts on Zabbix. For me, it took like 5 days to get to that point. You would do it in 3 seconds, but hey, that's it. I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs, right? The graphs themselves are obviously completely unexciting. The only thing I want to talk about in these graphs is that, again, they are a reflection of cluster-wide operation. Now we're not looking at server-by-server stuff. Now we're looking at the cluster itself and the cluster as a whole, which is the cool aspect. And as I said, none of the template for MariaDB MaxScale that I've seen actually does that, which is kind of silly. From a database perspective, I wouldn't see like what's going on in the cluster as a whole. Individual nodes are fine to dig into that, but I also want to see the cluster as a whole. How are my read and write splits going? How much reads and writes am I seeing in the cluster? Really exciting. As someone said, like, yeah, if there are managers in the room, this slide is for you. The rest of you can ignore this stuff. Yeah, okay. Haven't gotten there. Do we have time for a demo? How are we doing on time?
We have some time.
Good. So, yeah, this looks good. Okay, fair enough. So there are a couple of things to look at here. This is actually a live system. It's actually doing some work right now. We'll see in the reads and writes per time unit there. That's the total reads and writes to the left with those horrible red colors, right? Why is the cluster down despite it's working? Well, because I'm running 8 nodes on this poor laptop, and it sort of like loses track of itself now and then. So it thinks it's down when it's actually not. The only widget I want to talk about here is that actually guy that says up right now. That is a widget that is a calculation. And this is particular cluster-wide stuff, right? There's a calculation that goes on in the background based on some values. And the calculation gives me 3 different values, 0, 1, or 2. 2 means the cluster is up and running, everything is fine. 0 means the cluster is completely down, nothing can go down, you can't insert or select or anything like that. And 1, which is degraded, means that, well, the cluster is still working, but something is amiss, right? One of the servers is not doing what it should, so you're better off fixing that, right? Make sense? So let's see what happens when I look at MariaDB MaxScale. We did say that one had GUI too. So this is what MaxScale looks like. A similar kind of data. It tells you a lot of information here. As I said, everything you see in this GUI and everything that can be done with this GUI, until you ask, is available through the API and through the command line interface. You don't have to use a GUI, right? Good stuff. It's all built on one REST JSON API, right? It's all exploring that one, right? So that's how it works. The nice thing with this GUI and with this tool is that we can modify things, as I said, as we go along. This is a live running cluster. I got a thing running in the background, inserting and selecting some data, right? We saw that. So as we can look at the server here, right? Here's our server 2. It's the master. I'm not going to look at that. Well, it's currently the master. Now I'm going to do this. I'm going to look at the parameters. There's a value here that's, whoops, sorry, I need to edit that one. Whoops. There we go. I want to edit. There's a value here that says priority. I typically recommend people to always set priority in MaxScale for the servers, even though it's not strictly necessary. MaxScale will resolve a priority by itself, but it's better we do it ourselves and prepare for doing that, right? And MaxScale will pick the server with the lowest priority as the master in the cluster. But we just determined that we want to take that puppy out of operation. We're going to do something with it, right? So we want another server to take priority. Right now, the servers have priority 2, 4, and 6. So we changed this guy and put it to 8 instead. And before I click done editing, you see that it says state is master, synced, running, blah, 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 right? So we go there, we confirm, and we go back to this guy, and we see it will say we'll get another master eventually. MaxScale also goes around and changes monitoring. I don't know why that was so slow. Odd. You should change that. Oh. Odd. Did I not change that? Oh, I set it to 4. Let's put it to 10 instead, and we're done editing, and whoops, there we go. Now we got another master in the cluster, right? No big deal. Whilst we were doing this, our application in the background was happily inserting data transparently. It didn't see anything of the changes that we did here, right? Now, let's say I want to take a node out of operation. One of the read nodes that I'm reading from, one of the replicas, the way MaxScale think it is, I'm going to fix that. I'm going to upgrade the hardware or whatever, right? So let's go into one of those nodes and take this one. This is a replica. I go to this guy up here, and I say I want to drain it. which basically means that if we go back to this guy, eventually we're going to see that the number of connections to the one being drained, that's draining the one in the middle, the number of connections is going to go down to 0 eventually, right? And then we can fix it. Again, no effects on the users, completely transparent, and all of that stuff. All this is pretty neat, right? And just for you, the last part of my demo, my piece de resistance, like, hey, you're monitoring guys, you know, you love diagrams, you know, network diagrams and stuff like that. So let's see what the cluster looks like that we're running on. This is what it looks like. How much did I spend on this? None, actually. MaxScale generates this nice graph all by itself. So there's the monitor down there that monitors my 3 servers. There's a router service that does the job. These are my 3 servers. And there's a listener. It listens to 3306, blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff. Are we about to run out of time?
We got a couple of minutes.
Okay. Let me show you one more thing, or nah, let's not do that. Let's take questions instead. We've had enough of, I can do the conclusions. I should do that. I just want to conclude what I'm doing, right? So this thing, right? So what is MariaDB cluster? We talked about that. I talked a lot about Galera cluster. It's really powerful, high availability solution. If you want to run high availability with MariaDB, Galera cluster is what you want to use. MaxScale, you don't want to run Galera cluster without MaxScale. It's just this, right? When you're monitoring, which is what we're talking about here, REST JSON is the way to go. If you ask me, I think the Zabbix agent should be able to run HTTP, right? I don't know why it can't. Why I have to run HTTP from the Zabbix server? Don't ask me. I think that is stupid. But I'm here at the quarters of Zabbix, so I'm not going to say more about that if I say something bad, right? Zabbix can use MariaDB and MaxScale for discovery, and you can use MariaDB, a highly available MariaDB setup with MaxScale as a repository for Zabbix. Cool. And with that, thank you very much.